Good evening, my friends, and welcome to King's Hill, where the night stretches long, the roads wind like gnarled branches, and the world beyond the headlights is a mystery waiting to unfold. A perfect night for a quiet drive, or perhaps an unexpected passenger. But beware, my friends, for some journeys do not end where they begin. Tonight's tale of spectral sorrow is the chilling, the uncanny, the Vanishing Hitchhiker. Charles Nash was bone tired, the kind of tired that settles into a man after too many miles and too little sleep. He'd been running freight for most of his life, and though the company name on the doors had changed, the roads stayed the same. Long, empty, and winding. Tonight was no different. He was hauling a half-full trailer down the highway, skirting past the sign for a town known as King's Hill. The sign was the only thing he'd seen for miles, and yet, not 5 minutes after passing it, he saw something else. Alone on the highway, barely illuminated by his high beams, stood a girl. Her hair was wet, her dress pale, sticking to her damp from rain, which had only stopped a few moments prior. She smiled softly and stuck up a shaky, pale thumb. He pressed his brakes, slowly dragging the 40-ton machine to a stop just a few feet from the girl. She was young, no older than 20, but she smiled as she got in, and Charles smiled back. As she opened the door, a cold chill filled the cabin. "Cold night," Charles said, trying to break the ice as she sat down beside him. "Yes," she answered, slow and shaky, as if her mind was in another place. She gave him a small glance, her eyes pale and icy blue. "So, where are you headed?" he had asked, a bit unnerved. She murmured an address, somewhere not too far, just on the edge of town, and they drove in silence for a while. The road hummed beneath the tires, the mist curling around them, thick and white. Every so often, Charles would glance over at her. She sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she stared out of the rain-speckled glass. Something about her unsettled him. Maybe it was the way her dress was just a little too thin. Maybe it was the way she barely made a sound. Maybe it was the way the heater couldn't quite warm the air since she had sat down. He turned the knob to the right, heat now on full blast, and glanced over to her. But to his shock, she was gone. He looked in the back to see if somehow she had made her way there, but the cab was empty. Had he imagined her? A trick of the road, a waking dream, perhaps. He wasn't sure, until once more he looked down, and there in her seat, folded neatly, lay a small, blue scarf. Barely damp, and clearly hers. His stomach dropped, a cold pit forming in it. His mouth hung in shock. He kept driving. He had to know where she wanted to take him. He drove until a small path came into view, not a mile from the edge of town. The truck was too large to fit, so he grabbed the scarf and began walking the winding road. Till finally, a house appeared, old and worn from decades of time, but in the upstairs window a small light flickered. Someone was home. He walked to the door, knocking once, twice, 3 times. Silence. He reached his hand up to knock again, and the door swung open. A small woman met his gaze, her skin carved with time, her eyes icy blue. "I'm sorry if I woke you. I'd picked a young woman up earlier tonight, and she asked me to come here, but this was my daughter's," the woman said, reaching a shaky hand out to touch the scarf. "She wore this the night she died. I haven't seen this in 10 years. She looked up at him. Charles felt the world tilt beneath him. The woman's grip tightened, her lips quivered, and then in the silence that followed, a single breath of air stirred in the doorway. A breath that was not theirs. A whisper. "Thank you." And then the door shut, and warmth returned to the night air. Charles stood there, the house empty, lights off. The only sound was the slow return of rain. And by the time he got back to his truck, her seat was dry. He started it, driving off into the gentle rain, knowing that more than one spirit was laid to rest that night. So the next time you're passing by an old town, keep an eye out for strangers. This has been our rendition of The Vanishing Hitchhiker here at Kings Hill Horror. Have a good night, and remember, you never know what's coming next in Kings Hill.